discover the extraordinary journey of Prince Taharqa, from the ancient Nubian kingdom of Kush to becoming a powerful pharaoh of Egypt. In this gripping historical narrative, we unravel his triumphs, challenges, and enduring legacy as a black ruler who reshaped two lands' destinies, explore forgotten battles, politics, and symbolism of an era lost to time. In the searing heat of the African sun, where the Nile carves a green lifeline through barren deserts, an unlikely story began, one that would reshape the destinies of two great civilizations. It's a story often overlooked in mainstream history, yet it carries the weight of empires. Imagine a prince born not in the golden palaces of Thebes, but in the rugged highlands of ancient Nubia, a land of black kings, fierce warriors, and sacred pyramids rising from red sands. This was Kush, mighty, proud, and for centuries underestimated by its northern neighbor, Egypt. But in the shadows of dynastic decline and political chaos, the seeds of an empire-shifting revolution were quietly taking root. Egypt, by this time, was bleeding. The once unified kingdom that built the pyramids and ruled the ancient world was now fractured by infighting and weakened by foreign invasions. The grandeur of Ramses and the mystique of Akhenaten had faded into relics. Power was up for grabs. Meanwhile, to the south, the kingdom of Kush was undergoing a renaissance. No longer content to be seen as a cultural mimic or former colony, Kush had developed its own powerful identity, rich in gold, steeped in tradition, and spiritually aligned with Egypt's gods, particularly Amun. The temples of Jebel Barkal echoed with chants of divine prophecy. Among these hills, a child was born who would shake the ancient world. That child was Taharqa, a prince of the royal Kushite bloodline, raised in a kingdom that revered strength, piety, and destiny. He was no ordinary noble. Stories of his youth tell of a boy touched by the divine, brave in battle, wise beyond his years, and born with an unshakable belief in his purpose. He wasn't merely trained for rule, he was sculpted for it. And yet, the path ahead was unimaginable. For how could a Nubian prince from a so-called lesser kingdom dare to ascend Egypt's throne, an institution wrapped in 3,000 years of sacred tradition and divine bloodlines? The answer lies in the chaos of the times, and in Taharqa's iron will. As the 25th dynasty emerged, led by Kushite rulers who slowly pushed northward into Egyptian lands, Taharqa's moment neared. His uncle Piye had already launched a successful campaign into Egypt, planting the flag of Kush in the heart of Egyptian politics. But Piye ruled from afar. His successors faced resistance from rival dynasties and foreign interests. Taharqa's rise came not through inheritance alone, but through brilliant strategy, charisma, and relentless ambition. He was a warrior prince who inspired armies, negotiated with priests, and positioned himself as a restorer of order in a land desperate for stability. He was not just claiming a throne, he was reclaiming a spiritual legacy. What makes Taharqa's story extraordinary isn't just the geopolitics, it's the symbolism. He wasn't merely a black king ruling Egypt, he was a fusion of two worlds, a living embodiment of Africa's intertwined history, showing that the borders we imagine today didn't define power back then. His rule challenged racial narratives, colonial simplifications, and historical biases. To understand Taharqa is to confront uncomfortable truths about how African civilizations are remembered or deliberately forgotten. He was proof that greatness knows no geographic bounds and that African power once reached into the heart of what many consider the cradle of civilization. This is the beginning of a tale lost to many, yet echoing louder now than ever. The rise of Taharqa wasn't just a political shift, it was a reclamation. a declaration that Cush mattered, that black kings could rule Egypt not as conquerors, but as rightful heirs, that African history is not a footnote, but a foundation. And so we journey back to the sands of Nubia and the temples of Egypt to uncover the gripping, untold story of the prince who defied history and became Pharaoh. In the heart of Nubia, along the winding stretch of the Upper Nile, the kingdom of Cush flourished like a desert rose, resilient, vibrant, and rooted in traditions that predated even the pyramids of Giza. It was here, in the ancient city of Napata, nestled at the base of the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal, that Taharka was born. His birth was more than a royal event. It was an omen. The priests of Amun interpreted celestial signs that foretold greatness. Unlike other kingdoms that buried their secrets in stone, Cush celebrated its rulers in the open air through song, ritual, and reverence. Taharka arrived in a world where the divine and the political were not just connected, they were inseparable. Taharka came into a dynasty forged by visionaries. His father, likely a high-ranking noble or military commander, belonged to the extended royal family, while his uncle Piye was already a revered conqueror and philosopher king. The royal court was a unique synthesis of military council and theological institution. Kings weren't just kings, they were living deities, chosen interpreters of divine will. Piye, after his triumphal campaigns in Egypt, had declared the unification of the Nile Valley under Kushite rule as a sacred act. It wasn't about domination, it was about spiritual restoration. Taharka was born into this ideology with a legacy to protect and a mission to fulfill. From the earliest age, Taharka was subjected to a rigorous program of education and training. He was taught the sacred texts of both Cush and Egypt, fluent in the theological lexicon of Amun, and skilled in diplomatic rhetoric. His mornings may have started with physical drills, swordplay, chariot riding, wrestling, and ended in temple studies under the watchful eyes of priests. He learned to read the stars, to decipher omens, to conduct rituals with precision. Leadership in Cush was not inherited blindly. It was earned through a relentless molding of mind, body, and spirit. Every lesson taught him one central truth. Rule is sacred, and a true king must bear both the burden and the blessing of divine favor. Cush was a marvel in its own right. Too often overshadowed by Egypt in the annals of history, it was a civilization of innovation, wealth, and profound spirituality. The land was rich in gold, ivory, and iron. Its people were deeply connected to their environment, harvesting the life-giving floods of the Nile and crafting cities that harmonized with nature. Napata, the cultural and spiritual capital, was adorned with temples and monuments that rivaled those in Thebes. When Taharka walked through its streets, he would have passed murals depicting legendary battles, divine births, and ancestral glories. The Kushite elite believed in cyclical history, that the past informed the future. For Taharka, this meant he was walking in the footsteps of gods and kings alike. But the world beyond Cush was far from tranquil. Egypt to the north was in turmoil, fractured into rival kingdoms, torn by greed and weakened by the encroachment of Libyan and Assyrian forces. The land of pyramids was a mosaic of decay, yet even in its disarray, Egypt remained symbolically powerful. To the people of Cush, Egypt wasn't just a neighbor, it was a cultural mirror and spiritual elder. Its decline was more than geopolitical, it was cosmological, a world out of balance. Within Kushite royal circles, it was whispered that a savior would rise, that one day a righteous ruler from the south would restore the order of Ma'at and revive the sacred balance of the Nile. For Taharka, this was not a fantasy, it was destiny. By his teenage years, Taharka was already a name of weight in court. He had attended councils with generals, debated theology with priests, and trained with some of the most feared warriors in the kingdom. He was being shaped not just as a prince, but as a living symbol. With each passing year, the vision of a united Nile Valley under Kushite stewardship grew more tangible. Egypt's instability was no longer a threat, it was an opening. And Taharqa, groomed in faith and fire, stood ready to step into history, not as a conqueror but as a restorer, not to steal Egypt's crown but to honor it, and to wear it with a purpose far greater than any pharaoh before him. Taharqa's path to power was neither direct nor peaceful. The journey from Nubian prince to Pharaoh of Egypt was paved with blood, prophecy, and the delicate art of diplomacy. Egypt during his youth was a fractured giant, its greatness still visible in shattered monuments, but its political reality unstable and fragile. Local warlords carved out petty kingdoms, rival dynasties contested legitimacy, and religious factions battled over spiritual dominance. It was a house of mirrors, powerful in image, hollow in substance. To most rulers, it looked like a collapsing relic, but to Kush and to Taharqa, it looked like a land waiting for rebirth. The 25th dynasty, founded by his uncle Piye, was the beginning of that vision. Piye's stunning military campaign brought much of Upper Egypt under Kushite influence, but Piye had ruled symbolically, choosing to remain in Napata and govern through surrogates. His conquest was spiritual as much as political. He sought to purify Egypt's corrupted temples and realign it with the old gods. Yet it was clear that more was needed. Egypt would not be healed through distance. It needed a ruler who would walk its land, rule from its cities, and speak its language in both word and ritual. That ruler was Taharqa. From his early 20s, Taharqa was thrust into battle. He wasn't handed power, he seized it city by city, forging alliances and crushing resistance. As a general, his campaigns were swift and disciplined. He knew that the people of Egypt were weary of warlords and chaos. They craved stability. Taharqa gave them more than order. He gave them hope. In each city he reclaimed. He reopened temples, paid homage to local deities, and respected regional traditions. His dual identity, Kushite by blood, Egyptian by spirit, allowed him to bridge a gap no other ruler could. He was both outsider and insider, conqueror and restorer. But his rise came at a dangerous time. The Assyrian Empire was rapidly expanding and saw Egypt as a soft target. Internal factions within Egypt, some backed by Assyrian diplomacy or bribes, posed constant threats to Kushite ambitions. Taharqa understood that he could not rely on military strength alone. He needed the gods on his side, publicly and theatrically. He poured resources into temple reconstruction, supported priesthoods, and revived ancient ceremonies that had fallen out of practice. He wasn't just stabilizing a nation, he was reanimating a spiritual world that had been silenced by decades of decline. Taharqa's greatest political weapon was legitimacy. He framed his ascension not as a coup, but as the realization of divine will. His lineage connected him to Piye, the liberator of Egypt, and his own victories reinforced that the gods had chosen him. He adopted traditional pharaonic titles, aligned himself with the sacred traditions of Thebes, and built monuments that depicted him in the classical style of Egypt's golden age. His presence in Egypt was not an invasion, it was a return. He wasn't replacing Egyptian identity, he was reminding the people of what it once meant. By the time Taharqa was officially crowned pharaoh, he had transformed perception. The boy from Napata had become a living symbol of renewal. His coronation was held with full ritual grandeur. Priests' processions and proclamations of divine favor echoed across temples. Statues of him began to appear from Karnak to Memphis, adorned in traditional regalia yet unmistakably Nubian in form. Taharqa had not just taken power, he had reshaped it. Egypt was no longer a broken kingdom scattered among warlords. Under his rule, it was becoming whole again. And at its center stood a black pharaoh whose rise had been foretold in legend and now played out in reality. The coronation of Taharqa was not just a royal affair, it was a resurrection. Egypt, long caught in the grasp of chaos and fragmentation, witnessed something rare, the reemergence of divine kingship. The rituals of coronation stretched over days, echoing the grandeur of dynasties past. Held in Thebes near the sacred temple of Karnak, Taharqa was crowned not merely as a king, but as a living god. He assumed the 5 royal titles of the pharaohs, each name a declaration of his earthly mission and celestial approval. When the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was placed on his head, it wasn't just a political act. It was a moment of cosmic realignment, a restoration of Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. What made Taharqa's coronation extraordinary wasn't just its splendor, but its symbolism. He was both a continuation and a disruption. His skin was darker, his features unmistakably Nubian, and his lineage traced not to the traditional dynasties of Memphis or Heliopolis, but to the desert strongholds of Napata. Yet there he stood, clad in gold and sacred linen, flanked by priests, nobles, and generals, proclaimed as pharaoh by the will of Amun. In that moment, centuries of silent tension between Kush and Egypt melted into something new, not submission, not rebellion, but synthesis. The crowd did not see a foreign usurper. They saw a ruler sent by the gods to cleanse a corrupted land. Taharqa moved quickly to assert his authority. He launched ambitious temple restoration campaigns, reviving the grandeur of sacred spaces neglected during years of political instability. From Karnak to Jebel Barkal, his vision was bold. Temples as centers of state power and religious renaissance. He commissioned statues of himself not merely as a mortal king, but as Horus incarnate, protector of Egypt, beloved of Amun. These images were not vanity, they were visual theology. Every carving, every column was a message to the people. Order has returned. Under his rule, religion and politics became one voice, declaring unity from Nubia to the Delta. Unlike rulers who hid or diluted their origins, Taharqa did something few dared. He exalted them. He refused to whitewash his Kushite identity for Egyptian acceptance. His monuments celebrated both cultures. He fused Egyptian aesthetics with Nubian traditions, creating a visual and ideological language all his own. In his building projects, he depicted himself wearing the pharaonic regalia, but also added motifs from Kushite symbology, lion-headed deities, exaggerated crowns, and scenes of southern victory. He wasn't merely adapting to Egypt, he was expanding Egypt's self-concept. Through him, the boundaries of what it meant to be Egyptian began to shift. Administratively, Taharqa was just as visionary. He reorganized the priesthood, expanded temple economies, and re-established royal authority in distant provinces. He dispatched trusted officials, many from Kushite nobility, to govern crucial cities, ensuring loyalty and efficient taxation. He understood that for his reign to endure, he needed more than charisma. He needed structure, and so he built it. His court was a careful balance of old Egyptian elites and new Kushite power brokers, united under his vision of harmony. To the people, he was not an occupying force. He was a stabilizer, a force of gravity in an age of disarray. In every way, Taharqa embodied the dual soul of his empire. His reign stood not at the margins of African or Egyptian history, but at their intersection. His image, stoic, serene, and deeply powerful, spread across temples and stelae, not only in Egypt, but deep into Nubia. He ruled not as a tyrant, but as a restorer. And though the challenges ahead would be immense, in that moment of coronation, Taharqa had done something few rulers ever achieve. He made two civilizations believe they were one. He was the Pharaoh of the Nile, the son of two worlds, and the king whose crown bore the weight of history and hope alike. Taharqa's reign was marked by ambition, resilience, and a vision for unity that defied the fragmented politics of the era. From the moment he took the throne, he viewed Egypt and Kush not as two nations joined by conquest, but as one divine realm stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. Under his rule, the Nile Valley became a single cultural and administrative axis. Trade flourished, temples hummed with activity, and border skirmishes gave way to fortified peace. For the first time in generations, Egypt had a ruler who wasn't merely sitting on a throne. He was building a civilization. One of Taharqa's most enduring achievements was the spiritual revival he initiated across both kingdoms. He didn't just restore temples, he rekindled belief. For a people battered by war and dynastic decay, faith had withered. Taharqa reignited it by making religion the centerpiece of governance. He financed massive expansions at Karnak, introduced new rituals to honor Amun, and even synchronized Egyptian and Kushite festivals to forge a shared spiritual calendar. In his eyes, divine unity was the foundation of political stability. Under his rule, the temples became not only religious centers, but economic and administrative powerhouses, employing thousands and shaping the daily life of the empire. Infrastructure was another pillar of his reign. Taharqa poured resources into revitalizing Egypt's agricultural systems, particularly the canal networks that had suffered from years of neglect. He knew that political unity meant nothing if his people were starving. His investment paid off, harvests stabilized, grain reserves increased, and local markets thrived. Trade routes stretching from sub-Saharan Africa to the Levant were reopened or reinforced, with caravans bringing exotic goods, foreign diplomats, and knowledge into the empire. This economic boom wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Every irrigation canal, fortified border town, and bustling port was part of Taharqa's vision for an empire that stood tall among the world's great powers. But greatness invites enemies. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its militaristic expansion, saw Taharqa's success as a direct threat. They had already begun meddling in the politics of the Near East and saw Egypt as their next prize. Taharqa, aware of this looming danger, prepared for war while simultaneously trying to hold his kingdom together. Internally, there were revolts in the Delta, many incited by nobles who viewed the Kushite dynasty as foreign interlopers. Assyrian agents fueled these uprisings with promises of wealth and power. Taharqa responded with a delicate mix of diplomacy and force, offering clemency to repentant rebels, crushing the defiant, and constantly reinforcing the narrative that he was the protector, not the oppressor, of Egypt's soul. In the face of these mounting threats, Taharqa never lost sight of the future. He understood that a king's reign is fleeting, but a king's story can be eternal. And so he built pyramids, temples, statues, and inscriptions that would outlast war, politics, and even memory itself. His burial site at Nuri was monumental, a pyramid complex that rivaled those of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Inscriptions etched in stone tell of divine dreams, celestial mandates, and his sacred obligation to uphold Ma'at. He was not just recording history, he was crafting legacy, a legacy that declared Africa's kings were not only rulers of land, but shapers of destiny. In a time when empires rose and collapsed like sandstorms, Taharqa's rule was a beacon. He stood at the crossroads of African pride and Egyptian tradition, refusing to abandon either. He governed with wisdom and might, with faith and foresight. Though his reign would soon be tested by the fires of Assyrian invasion, What he accomplished during his years of unity was unprecedented. Egypt and Kush, so long seen as rivals or siblings, became, under Taharka, one body, one soul. And for a moment in history, under a black pharaoh's reign, Africa spoke with one voice. The serenity of Taharka's reign would not last. From the heart of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire, vast and brutal, set its sights on the Nile. Under kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, the Assyrians had mastered war, siege engines, psychological warfare, and unrelenting conquest. Egypt, with its gold, prestige, and spiritual importance, became their next target. For Taharka, this wasn't merely the defense of a kingdom, it was a defense of history, of faith, of African sovereignty. The war that followed wasn't just a clash of empires, it was a confrontation between worldviews, between a unifying black pharaoh and the rising storm of foreign imperialism. As Assyrian legions approached, Taharka responded swiftly. He mobilized his seasoned Nubian warriors and Egyptian militias, fortified strategic cities like Memphis and Thebes, and launched a bold diplomatic campaign to win over wavering governors. But his true genius lay in optics. He held massive public ceremonies invoking Amun, positioned himself as a divine shield against foreign gods, and turned his resistance into a religious movement. While the Assyrians relied on fear, Taharka inspired faith. He wasn't just a general, he was the living embodiment of resistance. In the temples, people prayed in his name. On the battlefield, they died with it on their lips. The early confrontations were hard fought. In a series of rapid campaigns, Taharka repelled the first waves of Assyrian aggression, reclaiming cities and earning the loyalty of Egyptian factions who had once doubted him. He used geography to his advantage, luring Assyrian forces into the delta's labyrinth of canals and marshlands, stretching their supply lines and ambushing them with precision. For a time, it seemed Egypt might hold. Yet the Assyrians were relentless. They returned with greater force, bringing siege engines, foreign mercenaries, and brutal tactics. One by one, border towns fell. The psychological toll was immense. Temples were desecrated, citizens enslaved, and resistance seemed doomed. Still, Taharka did not yield. Even as the Assyrians installed puppet kings in the north, he held fast in the south. Thebes and Napata remained strongholds of loyalists. He funded guerrilla campaigns, organized local rebellions, and used the power of myth to keep the idea of his kingship alive. His image, carved into temple walls, remained untouched. His name continued to be invoked in state rituals. This was not passive endurance, it was psychological warfare. The Assyrians may have claimed Egypt, but they never broke it. Taharka's resistance transformed the war from territorial conquest into a battle for the very soul of Egyptian identity. In a stunning act of defiance, Taharka launched a counteroffensive that temporarily shifted the tide. He retook Memphis, drove out the puppet rulers, and reignited a fire of hope throughout the land. Reliefs show him as a warrior lion crushing his enemies beneath his feet. It was a moment of triumph, of vindication, but victory came at a price. The Assyrians responded with overwhelming force. Taharka's armies, exhausted and overextended, could not hold. Eventually, he retreated south to the heart of Kush. It was not a flight of fear, but of strategy. His retreat preserved the kingdom, protected its culture, and bought time for the next chapter. Though absent from Egypt's throne, Taharka remained a shadow in every temple, a whisper in every rebellion. From Napata, he continued to coordinate resistance, maintain loyalty, and shape the legacy of his dynasty. To his enemies, he was a ghost that would not die. To his people, he was legend made flesh. And in stepping back from the battlefield, Taharka stepped into myth. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of resilience, of spiritual strength, and of African sovereignty in the face of empire. The war for Egypt may have worn his body, but it could never touch his soul. Taharka's legacy is one of the most profound and misunderstood in ancient history. Though his physical reign over Egypt ended in retreat, his spiritual and cultural impact echoed across continents and centuries. He wasn't merely a historical figure, he became a symbol of resistance, unity, and Black African kingship in an era when later narratives would attempt to erase or diminish his significance. While many rulers are remembered for what they conquered, Taharka is remembered for what he represented, a fusion of civilizations, a defiant voice against imperial dominance, and a black monarch who stood at the crossroads of empires. In his homeland of Kush, his name was spoken with reverence. He was buried at Nuri beneath one of the largest pyramids ever constructed in Nubia, a structure that rivaled even the great pyramids of Egypt in scale and symbolism. His mortuary texts spoke of divine dreams, celestial favor, and a destiny carved by the gods themselves. His successors emulated his governance, policies, and spiritual devotion, modeling their reigns on the blueprint he had established. Temples across Nubia bore his name. The stories of his military valor and his refusal to submit became part of the cultural DNA of Kush. There, he wasn't just a former ruler, he was a cultural ancestor. Far beyond the borders of Nubia and Egypt, echoes of Taharka's story found their way into oral traditions. In parts of Sudan and Ethiopia, elders spoke of a great black king who defied foreign powers and protected his people's spirit even in exile. These were not myths invented in hindsight. They were fragments of memory, passed through generations when written history was denied to entire cultures. In these tales, Taharka was a lion-hearted leader, not only of nations but of identity itself. And while his physical crown was lost to time, the symbolic crown of pride, of unity, of resistance remained untouched. In the modern era, Taharka has emerged from the margins into the spotlight. Scholars of African history and Afrocentric thought have championed his story, not merely as a footnote in Egyptology, but as a central pillar of African civilization. His likeness has appeared in Pan-African murals, Black liberation literature, and academic research that challenges Eurocentric historical paradigms. He forces the world to reevaluate assumptions about race, history, and empire. In Taharka, we see a king who embodied black power, not in the modern political sense, but in the ancient, sacred, and undeniable sense of sovereignty and self-determination. And yet, for centuries, Western textbooks either ignored him or diminished him. His Nubian roots made him a threat to colonial-era narratives that sought to divorce Egypt from the rest of Africa, to place it within a European-leaning Mediterranean world, sanitizing its African essence. A black pharaoh who ruled Egypt, built monumental temples, and resisted the mightiest empire of the Near East, did not fit the narrative, and so he was silenced, not by accident but by design. But history, like the Nile, always finds its path. Today, Taharka's name resurfaces in curricula, documentaries, and museum exhibitions worldwide. The truth can no longer be buried. Taharka's legacy is not just historical, it's prophetic. In a world still grappling with issues of representation, justice, and the decolonization of knowledge, his story matters more than ever. He reminds us that leadership is not about origin, but vision, that power, when wielded with spiritual integrity and cultural pride, becomes transformative. He reminds Africans and the global diaspora that their history is not one of subjugation, but of greatness, often hidden, sometimes stolen, but never destroyed. In Taharka, we don't just find a king, we find a mirror of what is possible when belief and purpose converge. His legacy lives wherever people rise, resist, and reclaim their rightful place in history. Why does Taharqa matter today? Because his story challenges everything we think we know about power, history, and identity. In a world where the dominant narratives are often written by the victors or those with the loudest voices, Taharqa's life reminds us that silence is not absence. His was a voice once buried beneath centuries of erasure, yet it speaks louder now than ever. He wasn't just a king from a forgotten dynasty. He was a symbol of black brilliance and resilience, ruling one of the world's most iconic civilizations with dignity, strength, and vision. His story doesn't whisper from the past, it roars. In the modern conversation around race, heritage, and global justice, Taharqa's legacy serves as both sword and shield. His reign dismantles the tired myth that African civilizations were somehow inferior or disconnected from global progress. Taharqa didn't rule in isolation. He negotiated with kings, confronted empires, led theological revolutions, and left monuments that still defy time. To acknowledge his greatness is to confront uncomfortable truths, that colonialism twisted history, that racism masked legacy, and that Taharqa's image, his very blackness, was too powerful to be left unchallenged. For centuries, history tried to forget him, but the world is remembering. Taharqa's relevance, however, extends beyond the color of his skin. He is a case study in leadership, visionary, moral, and adaptive. He governed not only with authority, but with purpose. In times of division, he unified. In times of invasion, he resisted. In times of despair, he rebuilt. His leadership was rooted in values that transcend time: spiritual conviction, cultural pride, and a deep sense of duty to the people he served. In a modern world reeling from political instability and moral ambiguity, Taharqa offers a timeless model, a ruler who saw his position not as privilege, but as profound responsibility. In classrooms, museums, and public discourse, his story is beginning to emerge, and with it, a new opportunity to rewrite the narrative, not by distorting facts but by restoring them. Including Taharqa in the global memory isn't revisionist, it's restorative. When students of African descent learn about him, they aren't just learning about the past. They are reclaiming a part of themselves. They are reminded that greatness is not something imported. It was born on their continent, written in their blood, and immortalized in pyramids, temples, and legacies like Taharqa's. His life bridges the Nile and the classroom, the past and the possible. In the face of modern cultural erasure and identity crises, Taharqa's memory stands as resistance. He proves that truth, even buried under centuries of distortion, can rise again. That history, when reclaimed, can heal, and that leadership, when guided by justice and vision, can endure far beyond empires. He does not belong only to Kush or Egypt. He belongs to humanity. His story teaches us that civilization is not a European invention. It is an African birthright, and that legacy, like the Nile, flows eternal when nourished by truth. So why does Taharqa matter today? Because in remembering him, we remember ourselves. We remember that African history is not a shadow of greatness. It is greatness. That black identity is not a struggle to overcome, but a strength to celebrate. That the line between history and hope is drawn by those who choose to remember. Taharqa's reign may have ended in the annals of empire, but his impact has only just begun. As long as there are people searching for truth, pride, and purpose, his story will live on, not as a relic, but as a revelation.